here today, I have no hidden agenda. I am fighting for my future. Losing my future is not like losing an election or a few points on the stock market. I am here to speak for all generations to come. I am here to speak on behalf of the starving children around the world whose cries go unheard. I am here to speak for the countless animals dying across this planet because they have nowhere left to go. I am afraid to go out in the sun now because of the holes in our ozone. I am afraid to breathe the air because I don't know what chemicals are in it. I used to go fishing with my dad until just a few years ago we found the fish full of cancers. In my life, I have dreamt of seeing the great herds of wild animals, jungles and rainforests full of birds and butterflies. But now I wonder if they will even exist for my children to see. Parents should be able to comfort their children by saying, everything's going to be all right. It's not the end of the world. But I don't think you can say that to us anymore. Are we even on your list of priorities? At school, even in kindergarten, you teach us how to behave in the world. You teach us not to fight with others, to work things out, to respect others, to clean up our mess, not to hurt other creatures, to share, not be greedy. Then why do you go out and do the things you tell us not to do? In my country, we make so much waste. We buy and throw away, buy and throw away, buy and throw away, buy and throw away, and yet northern countries will not share with the needy. Even when we have more than enough, we are afraid to share. My dad always says, you are what you do, not what you say. Well, what you do makes me cry at night. Here, you may be delegates of your government, business people, organizers, reporters, or politicians, but really, your mothers and fathers, sisters and brothers, aunts and uncles. I am only a child, yet I know if all the money spent on war was spent on finding environmental answers, ending poverty, and finding treaties, what a wonderful place this earth would be. I'm only a child, yet I know we are all part of a family, 5 billion strong. In fact, 30 million species strong. And borders and governments will never change that. I'm only a child, yet I know we are all in this together and should act as one single world towards one single goal. And should act as one single world towards one single goal.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the October 27th radio show, Lecture for the Transition. I want to apologize for missing last week. The stress of the movie and the obligations are starting to wear on me, and due to it, in fact, I want to apologize again because after this show, I'm going to have to shut down the lectures for the time being until further notice, until I can kind of see the light at the end of the tunnel with the film, because I am indeed running out of time. So I hope you guys understand that, but as soon as I kind of get situated and I can get through the edit, I will resume the shows. It does take a good amount of time to put these together, a number of hours, and it's just tough to break that mode of operation because of the work I'm doing with the film. The opening was from Zeitgeist Day 2010. The little girl speaking at the time was Seven Suzuki. It was a UN Earth Summit in 1992. Jacques mentioned to me early on when I spoke with him, I think my first interview with Jacques, he commented how children tend to understand the concepts of a resource-based economy and the Venus Project faster than adults. And I think this is an easy case in point. You can go to YouTube and see the full speech by Seven Suzuki, And it's really amazing to see the simplicity of her commentary and the obviousness of it, I think, is a better word to describe it. And as we seem to grow older and these facades of society, of institutionalization, of identity, of established infrastructures, of associations with your particular country and models of economics begin to arise, suddenly everyone loses sight of what's actually important. And I was blown away when I first heard that speech by Seven Suzuki. I assume she's about 30 years old now. I have no idea where she is or what she's doing, but hopefully she's still an activist as she was back then. By the way, people often ask me about the United Nations, and they say, well, the Zeitgeist movement wants to have a global issue. Have you guys tried to do anything with the United Nations? And I would like to say outright that while the United Nations has a possibility of doing something, as it always has, you got to remember what the United Nations is at this point in time. It is a collection of these country representatives, and the country representatives really have only one true responsibility within the global paradigm, and it has nothing to do with their people. It has to do with the GDP and economic viability of their country. And this is why the problems that the United Nations were supposed to take care of and ameliorate, such as sweatshop slavery, atrocious pollution, depletion, deforestation, energy emissions, globalization problems, or economic colonialism is what you should really call it. And of course, the wars, it has failed miserably. The United Nations is a complete and utter disgrace. You could also argue that the intent of the United Nations was to just simply centralize power for the West, and I think there's probably some truth to that too, just like the WHO, the World Bank, the IMF, and all of these pseudo-global organizations that, they marvel in their poetry like they're supposed to be encompassing the planet and all the world's people when they really don't. There's vested interest across the board. If the United Nations had did its job, as it's supposed to do, it would have slammed sanctions against the U.S., England, and the entire Iraq coalition upon its invasion. I mean, it was not sanctioned by the UN Security Council or accord with the UN Charter. Why? It just let it go, because America runs everything. It is the dominant empire. And even the UN can't compete with that, and the people within the UN are not about to step up to the big bully in the room. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there because, I consider the UN to be a complete disgrace. While I don't dismiss anybody, you just have to look at what it is, what it was supposed to do, what its points were, and it's just another sad conglomerate of crap that has been polluted by the monetary system and the self-interest of countries, and it will not stop World War III or anything else, especially once energy scarcity and problems continue to arise. So I don't want to belabor any of this, but it's depressing. It's depressing to see what it could have been in a positive sense and getting the level playing field going, but the mechanics of society, the way it's set up, won't allow for such a thing. So I just want to reiterate that. Okay. The transition. When people ask me about the transition, they often don't really know what they're asking. And I often ask them back, I say, well, which transition are you referring to? Are you referring to a transition where the world has agreed upon this direction and with little inhibition they will systematically fold certain institutions while creating others and step-by-step move into a resource-based economy in a very fluid way? Or are you talking about a transition which includes the transition of education, which is this extremely complex process of shifting establishment, institutions, and mindsets away from the current paradigm and focusing them onto the more sustainable paradigm, maneuvering through institutions, creating unique programs to bring people in, unique programs to fight the more cancerous attributes of the system. These are the two basic transition environments that people need to think about. And naturally, people are referring to the latter, but they never really fully understand what comprises such a thing, which, again, I'm going to hope to communicate today. So the first scenario is going to be called the ideal transition scenario. And this is a fantasy scenario which essentially is my take on the path of unfolding of how, if the option was there to make a step-by-step move into a resource-based economy, assuming that I or whomever that is following this path actually had the power to implement it. And that's why it's a fantasy. But the reason I'm bringing it up is because it shows a specific train of thought, and I think there's certain attributes to it in policy that you'll probably see anyway in certain economies because there's really no other choice. So anyway, the probable transition scenario, which is the second scenario, has to do with the way things will likely unfold within a certain, average understanding. You're going to have to take all of this with a grain of salt. I mean, you need to understand. I mean, a lot of people ask, they say, well, Jacques has been working on this for so long. Why doesn't he have a transition plan? I have a lot of arrogance out there amongst different communities, and they think they know. And I'm sorry, you don't. We're not prophets. You don't think Jacques, after 94 years on this planet, spending 70-plus years at a minimum on this work, hasn't given an extravagant amount of thought to the possibility? And there's a reason why when you ask him about it, he gives you a very generalized statement that it's very hard to predict because there's no point in many circumstances to even try and navigate through. In fact, you might get that same feeling as I attempt to do it. So before I jump into those two scenarios, however, I want to make 5 quick points that come up frequently with regard to transition and with regard to the current state of affairs. First point is simple. The mark of the beast is debt, and everyone out there needs to do whatever they can to get out of debt. You can't do anything with the shackles of debt holding you down. I know it's easier said than done, believe me, but I just want to make the general suggestion to really try to do whatever you can to get out of whatever debt you have, because that is the invention of servitude of the current system, of this sort of hegemonic domination of society. Whether it's advertent or not, it is there. It's not conspiratorial. It's right there for everyone to see. The debt isn't real. We have a world of debt slaves on multiple levels. So anyway, with regard to the transition, as the breakdown continues, everyone needs to get out of debt. Second point, which is unrelated, the transition does not change the end goal. So if you're not satisfied with what I communicate today, or if you're not satisfied with anything that you can come up with, it doesn't change anything as far as the goal. If I have to go to the store and get a dire medical prescription for my survival, I'm not going to shrug it off because I forgot the directions to the store. The goal is there, and the goal is needed. The path of unfolding to get there is obviously a variable that has to be taken into account. It's relevant, but it doesn't change the end goal. So if you run into people that say, well, you guys don't know how you're going to get to what you're doing, so therefore I'm not interested, well, first of all, they obviously don't even understand the necessity of the system to begin with. The transition is a secondary problem, and it doesn't change the goal whatsoever. It would be different if the goal was utterly irrational or far too fantastic to be technologically or socially feasible, but that is not the case whatsoever. There's no attribute of this economic model that is problematic that I can find, and the real issue comes down to testing the full system naturally through the scientific method. But it's important to point out that all the components we are talking about are not that radical. And there's no logic to show that once put together, somehow all the component parts wouldn't work. Bridging all of the attributes and components that comprise a resource-based economy is going to be a challenge, but it's no more challenging than building a bridge between two islands. It's no more challenging than doing any type of infrastructure project that's done every year throughout the world. It's simply another technical problem that needs resolution, and none of the attributes of that resolution are outside of the realm of modern scientific knowledge today. And point 3, which might seem like a mild paradox compared to point 2, and this will lead into point 4, is that we are always going to be in some type of transition. So just keep that in mind as a general technical understanding, or even philosophical understanding, is that there's always a state of transition. I think a resource-based economy will achieve its definition once we get rid of money and rely exclusively on resource management. But there can still be tremendous amounts of social change occurring within the system, and there will be. But just keep that in mind. So I hear this rhetoric a lot. They say that once they achieve this, once we achieve that, you're always going to be in a state of transition. And that leads me to point 4, regarding the specifics of police and security, because this comes up a lot. People say, oh, and law. People say, oh, well, you guys are talking about a world without police, security, and law. I can't fathom that whatsoever. And it's usually a good idea not to bring that up immediately to people. The best way to describe it is to say, listen, we want to create an environment which slowly reduces the necessity for police, security, and law, over time hyperbolating or ideally manifesting the need for having zero police, security, and law. And then you can outline the reasons why that is, about solving social problems, about eliminating the income gap, and all of the causal attributes that are generating all of the destruction and distortion that you continually see and is growing. So just want to point that out. I hear that a lot. And point 5, very quickly, and I've stated this before, it's just important to point out that no single country can create a resource-based economy on its own, because a resource-based economy is based upon planetary management. Now, going back to transition, you could say that, well, maybe a meteorite might fly into our solar system and be accessible to us for mining for precious minerals, and that could very easily happen. So obviously you're extending the resources of the planet to the external, but you get the internal logic. There's many different reasons why a country can't just claim to be a resource-based economy. If it was isolated, it only has access to the resources it has there. The United States and the history of colonialism is what it is. They would never leave an isolated area alone if everyone there was able to actually support themselves with the internal resources that they had. It wouldn't work within a global monetary system to have pockets of communes, if you will, regardless of how large they would be. It simply would create conflict originating from the external, I can assure you. This is why we need a global system. It's not that it's just ideal to have a global system. There's no other option but to have a global system, because there's really no escape, I was reading the other day, and I had a little fantasy, because a lot of people in the movement, they think to themselves, if we could only just get away from the dominant forces, and I share that, the dominant forces of the monetary system and these values, and I actually do share that to a certain degree, even though I like resolution. But I was thinking to myself, what if we lived just a couple hundred years more in the future, and we understood space-time a little bit better, and the hypothetical, Wheeler topological feature, the wormhole in theoretical physics, was actually understood, and it was actually calculable, and we could just pile on to a spaceship, get into a wormhole, get the hell away from the solar system and this galaxy, and just send ourselves to some other place on the other side of the universe where nobody from the monetary world could find us, and then terraform a planet and live happily ever after. Obviously, that's a complete joke, so please no one post that as though I'm proposing that as a solution. Thank you. But it is fun to think about, because I feel the escapist attribute as well, and believe me, if there was an option to escape, I would certainly consider it, but there is none. We have to stand and face the environment around us. We are on this planet, and we have to take control of it in an intelligent way before these mechanisms of ancient folkways, of detrimental perspectives, destroy it around us. Okay, so let's begin. Ideal transition. First thing that has to happen, you have to resolve the current artificial crises facing humanity. Universal debt forgiveness of all private and public debt. The slate is wiped completely clean. You simply get rid of all the debt in one fair swoop, and frankly, that's what's being done, or it's what's going to be done in the future, because there's no other option. But that's what's done. Next, unemployment. The only way you can overcome the growing technological unemployment and an economically generated unemployment which of course would be helped when you eliminate the debt pressures, but nevertheless technological unemployment is real. What you do is you have to reduce the workday for those that are currently employed to allow for others to come in, adjusting the pay scales accordingly to meet a minimum standard of living. So someone working 40 hours a week would share that with, for example, someone working 20 hours a week, each working 20 hours a week with their pay scale adjusted to meet their standards of living. Notice I didn't say meet minimum wage, which statistically does not take into account what people need to survive or any specific human condition within the system. You have to have a thorough evaluation of each individual's circumstances, problems they might have, to consider such a thing as minimum wage. Minimum wage has no statistical basis, and its relationship to average human survival is nil. So wages are adjusted based on the specific disposition of the individual and the family. That's the only logical way to do it if you're going to use a system of such. Oh, and by the way, I'll talk about how to transition from the labor economy through technological application as we move forward. Please understand that anyone listening to this ideal transition I'm talking about, you're going to be able to poke a tremendous number of holes into it. If I was to write this out, it would take so many attributes to define all of the caveats and specifics, and it's not fit for a radio show. And by the way, this is a fantasy. I'm showing a specific logic. Some of it might be implementable through time. Some of it will not. The system is going to do whatever the system is going to do, and most likely rationality isn't going to have a play for the most part. So, that being said, wages are adjusted to make sure people can afford the basic necessities of life at a bare minimum. Again, minimum wage is socialism, people. So for those of you out there that are so anti-socialistic in this laissez-faire kind of world, it's time to grow up. Now, moving on to the banking system. Fractional reserve lending policy is eradicated and monetary growth system stops. This means the boom and bust cycle is virtually removed. And what you do in transition is create a one-to-one correlation where money is paired with consumer demand and services. In other words, money is regulated to match the total value of goods and services in the system. Statistically, money is still generated in paper form, it's still fiat, but it is calculated in a statistical assessment of market turnover. So the total existence of money and the money supply is equal essentially to the fixed rates of goods and services in the system, again quantified by the average rates of turnover. Now, this system, again, would need many, many qualifiers, but it's important to understand that the mean value of the total money supply would be set for any nation with a certain flexibility, which for minor expansion and contraction around a central mean, which does not carry over into long-term growth ever. So periodic adjustments can be made when monetary disimbalances between sectors and class demographics occur, which would persist because even with such strict monetary regulation, it does not change the basic corrupt psychology and self-interest in gaming strategies to acquire that money, which of course is one of the big points of a resource-based economy, to overcome those attributes. I want to make a quick point of, this kind of, again, laissez-faire distinction of economics where you just remove any type of policy. Really what this is, it's like taking a group of hyenas and starving them for a couple of weeks, loading them up with crank and throwing them into a big pit with a dead cow in the center of it. And the dead cow has been noted to feed all of them equally. But yet, what are they going to do? They are going to create gaming strategies. They are going to fight to obtain this scarcity as brutally as possible. They will create little groups. They'll work in pairs. They will work to do whatever they can in their small pockets to secure their positions of advantage to gain that food. And this is exactly what the entire corporate and global market structure is. Groups of mafias working to get their piece of the pie regardless of how they do it. And there's no such thing as the invisible hand and a fair balance for anyone. And I'm sorry to say, the world you see around you is the result. So any of the economic theorists out there that continue to harp on some fantasy invisible hand and that big government is the problem, no, it's not. Big government, I hate to say it, is what will, in fact, save the entire market system in its corrupt fashion of organization. It is the regulation of this system which is required and has always been required, always, And anyone that doesn't see that does no idea what they're talking about, and the propaganda that big government has been the problem is just that, propaganda with zero statistical analysis or basis of what the real problems of the market system are. But I won't go on that tangent. And once again, I want to continue these qualifiers and caveats to what the focus of a resource-based economy is. This isn't some big government resource-based economy association. We want to eliminate the protocols of government as we know it today as well by resolving the actual problems and orienting society scientifically. So please don't misunderstand. Now, back on point. So, the unresolvable problem within the market system of monetary acquisition and hoarding, of course, still exists. Profit generation and wealth generation, savings. So in order to keep that balance, you have to have income limits set, both high and low. It's a natural attribute in a fixed economy. So income limits would be set, buffered by a certain finite expansion and contraction of the money supply. It's far from perfect, but it will keep inequality in balance while avoiding shortages of the money supply, which can derail shortages of production and things of such. Again, such a ratio can be statistically generated based on population, value, demand, and other parameters. And again, we're not advocating this type of structure. It is simply a transitional concept to try and get balance within the system as we move forward in transition. So likewise, while you have monetary regulation in this finite one-to-one ratio, statistically oriented and adjusted dynamically based on what's happening in the actual economy to continue a balance of distribution of the money, you'd have to have this ratio also exist on the global scale, since we currently have floating markets and these comparisons of currency. You get rid of the floating markets, first of all, and you make a solid statistically generated ratio of what the value of an economy is, its monetary correlation, the production of the money, how it's orchestrated, and you make a ratio to all other nations, so you end up with a statistical model that can be dynamically updated as well to keep the balance. I hope that makes sense to you. I don't want to go into a big detailed explanation of that, but if you really think about what I'm describing, it's very, very simple. And this leads me to Wall Street as a natural culmination of this evolution. You get rid of Wall Street. Wall Street system of trade investment is largely an illusion. It's a game manufactured that pulls all sorts of wealth into the hands of a select few. It's not there for the public. Public ownership, if you will, is a given in society as evolution and transition occurs. So the function of a corporation is naturally public. What else is a corporation supposed to be? The notion of shares of a company becomes obsolete. So it becomes a given that you don't need any of these third-party vehicles that are simply monetary inventions. So that's gone. Investment initiative, if those that want to think about that, would still come from banks, but there is no interest or usury, first of all. Usury would be made illegal, not because of some moral concept, but simply because it is a mathematically invalid concept in a fixed economy. For the interest income, as we know, as I've harped upon, does not exist outright in the money supply. Interest has always been regarded as a corrupt notion intuitively by even early religions. So it's time you just simply realize the mathematical reality of that. And this brings us to the corporation, which in its very abstract notion is sort of the mechanism of production and distribution in the current system. In order for a corporation to work in the transition, it has to maintain a particular legal status which can be revoked by a third party if they're not in compliance with very basic environmental and labor decency protocols, if you will. A statistical evaluation and regulation, which we do have today, but which is bypassed through various mechanisms which you can easily trace back to the corporation, but they use legal loopholes to do this. Regardless, if basic decency of labor usage and environmental awareness isn't used as far as pollution, as far as labor abuse, the business license is revoked and that corporation can no longer operate. Is this the evil state power? Yes, it is, but I'm sorry to say, left unabated, the hyenas will destroy everything. Once again, I want to remind everybody what the legal system, in fact, is in the current environment. It is predominantly based on monetary regulation. If you went through all of the legislation in existence in America, I guarantee you a vast majority of it relates to money in one way or another. So the very notion of legal establishment is a overriding third-party orchestration that makes sure that there isn't abuse within a system that naturally gravitates towards abuse. So I just want to continue to dismiss this myth that the problem is some type of intervention with the so-called free market. I can't reiterate that enough because I'm so tired of that fantasy being used. In fact, all it takes is one law in existence to debunk the idea that the laissez-faire market system concept has some integrity, which it does not, because there are thousands of laws in existence required to make sure the market system orients itself in some type of way that seems to be productive without corruption, which of course persists perpetually. Any system that requires heavy legislation to make sure it works is invariably and inherently a failed system on one level or another. So keep that in mind, which goes back to our point about resolving problems and the logic of removing the legal system through time, but I'm not going to talk about that right now. Okay, another transitional problem, a little decoupled from the current context, is the global poverty epidemic. Three things would need to occur. The United Nations or whomever would finance, subsidize, not corporations, but advanced independent food production facilities to produce condensed, scientifically engineered, nutritious food in a condensed form. It could come in an extruded tube, for example, that Jacques has talked about, which is extremely space efficient, where a block of this material could last for even a year in certain circumstances. Would it be tasty? It doesn't matter. These people are starving, and they need something now. Furthermore, desalinization plants are immediately implemented everywhere possible, hooked into aero and hydroponic agriculture, which would be implemented for growth needs. So you have food generation done technically through highly condensed nutrition. You imply desalinization plants liberally, along with aero and hydroponic agriculture, to begin to create normal food production in these environments. If you were to do this with money, it would take an extravagant amount of it. So what you do is you have to have an absolute state initiative, if you will, to bypass that and go straight to the resources, either through subsidization or whatever. You just do it. You just do it, because if you want to play the monetary game, you're going to have some serious problems. So a little open-ended on that distinction, but those three attributes have to occur one way or another if anyone is to care about the global poverty epidemic and transitioning out of that epidemic. The next crisis to address is the energy crisis, which of course most of the world is still unfamiliar with, at least in the West. We have to subsidize an entire energy project which will provide a fluid transition out of the fossil fuel hydrocarbon economy. What basically needs to happen is that all of the remaining fossil fuel energy needs to be utilized explicitly and deliberately for changing the global infrastructure quickly. This would have to come through a global initiative to literally nationalize all hydrocarbon resources on this planet, and a Manhattan Project of sorts of renewable energy issues should be created, and we use this remaining fossil fuel energy, which we are running out of, to change the infrastructure as, again, fast as possible across the world into renewables, and most likely a systems approach to avoid intermittency and everything else. As an aside, people talk about the limitations in the current system very viably, because it would take about $20 trillion and over 30 years to make the alterations possible, according to some ecological economists, if you will, that have invested time in researching this issue. And it's always been a big red flag. And the people that I've spoken with in regards to peak oil, one of the things they say is that the main problem isn't the fact that we don't have solutions, it's the fact that there's a path that has to unfold, which is going to be extremely difficult to achieve, given the hindrances of the economic system and the requirements of investment, return, and everything else. As we know, sustainability is not in accord with the basic ethos of investment return and the servicing of things rather than resolution of them. My friend Michael Rupert wrote a book called Collapse, which is originally called called Presidential Energy Policy, and at the very end of this book, he details a very intelligent manner of being able to get rid of all the problems associated with the abuse of the hydrocarbon economy and the attributes related to it. If anyone, it's probably online at this point, you could search for that, but I think there's some many good points in there. It's very, very detailed in a step-by-step logical way to move out of this system and to avoid further problems, if anyone wants to research that. Back to my point, you have to have a global initiative to change energy infrastructure if we expect to get out of this very problematic scenario. Okay, so we've dealt with the problem of inflation, debt, monetary expansion issues, making a system that avoids unemployment because of a systematic readjustment and shortening of the workday to bring whomever has the skill set into environments where they can be employed. This isn't perfect, and obviously there will be fallouts within such a thing, but it's the best that we can think of within this system, at least I can think of. We have energy infrastructure protocols changed. We have poverty being resolved through the implementation of desalinization, aeroponics, hydroponics, extruded food technologies with high nutrition. Corporations themselves are now strictly adhered to a strict ecological policy, and if they violate it, their entire ability to function can be removed, with competitive corporations taking up the market share. And as oversimplified as those issues are, I think it gives a general idea of what would need to happen to resolve basic issues in transition. Now, this leads me to some more direct overlap issues for transition regarding attributes of a resource-based economy that need to be implemented through time, such as the removal of money and the application of advanced technological methods to society which will override the entire labor system as we know it. So a value system first has to occur as well to adjust to these things, and that's a big part of it. So always keep that in mind. I'm going to try to be as clear as I can with this, but it is not an easy thing to discuss. What has to happen first, as these problems of the crises that we just discussed are resolved, is that there has to be a systematic nationalization of all basic good and service industries. The most common precedent that has been met so far in the current culture is, of course, the, quote, socialization of health care. Health care as a service is a fundamental human need, and it's a basic social attribute of personal and social health, which is something that people tend not to understand. Having healthcare isn't just about singular human health. It's not a selfish thing in and of itself, narrowly. It's also about resolving the possibility of disease epidemics and spreading of contagions that can infest everyone and make a problem for the entire society. The individual is a part of the group. The true threats to humanity are really those created by the environment that we don't have control over. We always talk about this in regards to earthquakes, but it also comes down to disease and microorganism plagues. These things can evolve very rapidly and gain immunity to our scientific methods of treating them, and we always have to be aware of what's happening in the society. So, point being, universal health care isn't just some individual necessity, it's necessity for the society, to make sure we monitor everyone and make sure that nothing that can invade the system, the social organism, can actually gain hold. So the provision of free health care that has occurred in Europe and in other countries is an important role, and it serves as a unique precedent for this so-called socialization. And regardless of what you want to call it, this type of pattern of subsidizing dire services for human well-being is what can create a fluid transition into a resource-based economy from the current economic model. As a quick aside, the subsidization of healthcare is done currently through taxation. Taxation and transition will be removed because it's not actually real or viable as an effective means. In other words, it's not actually needed. Taxation is an illusion. The public is made to feel like they're contributing to government and have accountability and keep the government accountable in the sense of their supposed contributions of money through taxation. But what needs to be understood is that all governments on this planet make money out of nothing, and they make money out of nothing whenever they want to, essentially. If taxation was real, you would have a one-to-one basis, and you wouldn't have budget deficits as government, acquires money from the public to use for its own issues. It does do this. It funnels money in that was created out of nothing, and then it just borrows more money out of thin air on top of it. It's just a big illusion, so I just want to throw that out there. Taxation is a waste of energy is what it really is in the modern system, but that's an aside. So, healthcare. Then comes utilities, water, energy, everything essential to living. Those become subsidized, socialized, nationalized. Then comes food resources, basic food resources. The basic standard of living attribute I talked about earlier would eventually be outgrown and replaced by literally the free provision of these food resources which can be acquired, creating the value system that things can be available for free. No one is going to go into one of these food distribution centers which have perishable items and take hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tomatoes because it's perishable. So what are you going to do with that much food that you know is going to rot and go to waste anyway? Why would you resell it in a system where everyone else can go and get the same tomatoes for free as well? This will prove the logic of the value transition, that there's no reason to hoard and have excess in a system that will provide an abundance for free. So it will enable a move out of the profit psychology. Initially, yes, it will have to have maximum allocation limits in certain areas, I suspect, just to say that, okay, you can take this, but you can only take so much of it. But in most circumstances, that would probably not be needed. And as we apply more mechanization, which I'll go over in a second, to our production capabilities to create a livable abundance, along with the value system of people beginning to understand and watch as crime rates become reduced in their society, as disputes, as the horrors that they tend to have gotten used to throughout the prior culture begin to subside and ameliorate, then you'll begin to see people begin to respect what the system is and what it's doing. Now, in order to buffer the loss of monetary allocation that is occurring in these industries that are being socialized and provided for free to the society, is you have to apply mechanization to those industries in the same ratio of loss, if you will, as the money that is being reduced. Hopefully that made sense. So in the food industry and agriculture, it's very, very easy to mechanize. So once it's applied liberally, the efficiency will be such and the maintenance will be minimal that it'll take very little money to run the oversight of those systems, enabling the free attributes of those provisions to be provided to society. So that balance of mechanization applies strategically to different sectors, which you could figure out statistically what would be the most relevant to move forward with as far as what's easiest to provide. In other words, you mechanize food production, you mechanize energy production, you mechanize utility infrastructure or regulation of such, and you go step by step through all the protocols of society. You could think of a gradient of relevance. At the highest end of the gradient is the most arbitrary, which would be the luxury goods in general factory distribution. So I hope you get the logic of that. The displaced labor and hence displaced purchasing power is overcome by the free provisions provided by society, and this systematic shift will slowly occur from one side to the other. I hope that makes sense. I could probably talk at length about that, but I'm slowly running out of time, and I think you get the basic idea. Simultaneous with all of this comes the need for what we call in a resource-based economy the assessment of the carrying capacity of the earth. So what has to happen is there has to be a global initiative for resource preservation and not exploitation naturally. And we can basically do this through agreements signed through different countries and their respective corporations, where each sector and its relevant corporations have to be objectively monitored for what resources they are using. Let me state that again. Each sector's resources needs to become publicly understood. The growth rates, the depletion rates, the capacity has to be publicly known and accurately updated and audited directly in all sectors to slowly create what will be first independent databases of resources in different sectors, and then merged essentially into a total Earth monitoring system that, of course, we refer to in the Zeitgeist movement and the Venus Project. This is a completely logical, and what you do is you just go step by step. You get corporations to simply provide the information, which many of them already have today, and you just compile it into a unified system so we can finally get a real picture of what we have on this planet, not to mention the processes that are being utilized. And you can use your own logic to see how you can extend that knowledge, especially with regard to the fundamentals of a resource-based economy that I've described in other talks. From there, with this global view achieved, then the implementation of the peak efficiency and peak preservation and essentially the peak sustainability mechanisms that I've talked about before are gradually implemented, eroding conspicuous and wasteful production methods of industry, level by level, through firm regulation, until a system of resource and distribution protocols are in place which are based explicitly on the mechanisms of peak sustainability. The allocations of those notions, excuse me, my language is all convoluted today. The allocation of those notions, I guess that makes sense. What I mean by that is the realization finally has to come that a true economy is about economizing. It's about being strategic with everything you do intelligently. And this is obviously an intellectual given. I think if you talk to most people and you explain this notion to them, they would likely assume that the current system actually does this, when in fact it does the opposite. We live in an anti-economy. So this is sort of the final step of getting this unified system together, which is demanded by human society, coupled with all the other attributes I've aforementioned. And then, once the pattern of continual applied technology to create valueless goods due to the rates of abundance that are achieved, coupled with the global management and peak efficiency mechanisms, the final thing to be eroded is the notion of private corporate ownership of any resource on this planet, and hence the monetary system itself. This is, of course, a very controversial step from the eyes of those of the establishment that are indoctrinated in the establishment orthodoxy. But you begin to see that it doesn't make any sense. If you're going to have a system of peak regulation, there's really no more free will for the corporation anymore. And if you really cared about demand for society, you would listen to what the society wants, and you would technically orient whatever products there are based on the most peak, efficient, and preservation-oriented sustainable mechanisms aforementioned, and that would be that. There's no more subjectivity with the industrialized system within the industry, the planetary industry that produces goods, which again is an entirely logical culmination. Again, as I stated before, the only objection anyone can have to this very simple logical approach to earthly management is the near superstitious notion that human nature won't allow it. And I think we've all begun to realize, and modern science has become to realize, despite all the debate, that humans are culminated by their environments. Their brains change based on their environments. There is a human nature, which is essentially this program that sits in our brains. There are things that should never happen to a human being, and there are things that very much need to happen to a human being through society. It's not a blank slate. It's very much there. There are, quote, instinctual, tropistic elements of human behavior, but the environment is what culminates our values and the way we view things 99.99% of the time. That extra 0.01% really barely manifests itself if the environment is supporting the positive attributes of human behavior. So anyway, I'm going to stop that tangent because that's not what this is about. So we erode private ownership, and eventually you have a centralized system. And money is removed because mechanization has reached a point where the major industries and productions can be run by very, very few people that do not require payment. and everyone else is able to enjoy the fruits of this society that actually takes care of them. And rather having society impose on them what they should be doing, their interest in survival will manifest on their own, and their interest in society will actually be greatly emphasized, and there'll be, in fact, an enthusiasm to want to help society because it helps yourself. And this is why the current system creates so much depression and laziness, is because it's a forced attribute. It doesn't have to be that way. I'm not going to go into some big treatise on the change of human values because it's a huge topic naturally, and there are many other attributes in this type of transitional scenario that could assist with such a thing, and a learning and educational process that can be employed to help people understand the necessity of these new values and how relevant they are. But anyway, I'm going to keep moving forward here. As many of you probably wondered why I haven't mentioned Jacques Fresco's city systems. City systems would be a given as the infrastructure changes and the focus on peak efficiency, peak sustainability, and peak preservation occur. These city systems could manifest themselves during the transition in certain economic structures that are willing to take the initiative to do so. Obviously, certain countries would be ahead of others in this transition for various geopolitical or wealth reasons based on their economy. So, but that is a natural progression. I've talked about that before, and so has Jacques. The city systems also serve as the technological hub in a holographic manner for the resource management and government organization, as we will know it in the future. The city systems will be interconnected with redundancy, but that's for a more in-depth conversation of the economy itself. With regard to the legal system, once again, remember that a great percentage of all crime will drop substantially once the basic provisions of life are achieved. You're looking at a 95%, conservatively, a 95% drop in all known criminal activity that we see today in the modern world. And naturally, what you'll see during the transition is a slow statistical drop of all forms of monetary crime as necessities of life are raised up and provided slowly for free, and all the other attributes that were just previously talked about. You will see this dynamically adjust as the new system is brought in. And I'm going to stop there as far as this kind of ideal scenario, which have many, many holes and many, many caveats, and I could talk at length about other specifics. But in reality, the second scenario that I want to talk about now is much more probable. So, second scenario. If you heard the prior lecture on the breakdown of societal collapse, the points made in that lecture, I believe there are basically four of them. You have constant economic growth creating perpetual debt and inflation. You have a cancerous profit system that doesn't care about ecology or human well-being, that produces for the sake of profit and not human well-being whatsoever. You have a general ecological breakdown, a disregard for energy crises that are about to emerge that could easily affect even population growth, affect almost every attribute of the economy. We've built our entire society based out of hydrocarbons. And then you have the issue of technological unemployment and the application of mechanization, which has been accelerated during these economic crises periods, which can only get worse. So you're going to see more mechanization occur as well. I don't have to go into the fall of society based on these attributes. I think that should be fairly clear to most of you. The question is, at what point will the public and the institutions that comprise society wake up and realize what the problem is? And that's essentially it as far as the transition in a real sense, which is why when you ask Jacques about it, he will explain that you have a lot of trouble ahead. The fact is, until the public understands the problem, nothing can change, and it's very hard to predict how long it's going to take the public to understand. It's very hard to predict how long it's going to take for the state to want to recognize any of this. It's very hard to predict when the selfish, reinforced interest of the corporate elite, if you will be willing to sacrifice the fruits of their work for so long in favor of a new system that benefits them along with everyone else. This is the problem. And I think really you're going to see massive social and civil unrest, and it's going to take a group like the Zeitgeist movement in company with many other groups that want to see change to literally push the governments into the right position. before it's too late, before World War III occurs, before there's real energy wars on this planet, before you have the systemic triggering that can lead to death and destruction on a scale that really hasn't been known to human society. The mechanisms that are in place now, if left unabated, will lead to so many problems that it's almost impossible to see where it might stop. You could end up, for example, in a transition scenario where instead of having, 1.5 billion people starving on this planet, and many more billion just flat suffering in deprivation, where you begin to reconcile. Okay, so most of the West right now reconciles that, we got a couple billion people miserable and dying, but, that's okay. It's just the natural Darwinian balance. And what happens is that psychology permeates and it continues. So what happens is they say, 1 billion, 2 billion, 3 billion, 4 billion, it's just the way it is. U.S. government's debts collapse, 40 trillion, 50 trillion, that's just the way it is. And you have this that's just the way it is mentality. Pollution, suddenly people put air filtration systems into their homes. It's just the way it is, modern life. And this type of lack of historical understanding and mind lock to that's just the way it is what will continue to hinder the transition, which is why the educational imperatives of the movement are so critically important. I can't reinforce that enough. To put it simply, the second scenario is the most logical scenario, which is the most unpredictable, which is that nothing's going to happen until severe biosocial pressures emerge. And then maybe the logical scenario, the first scenario I discussed, could actually be instituted somewhere along the path. But you're going to have a lot of people fighting along the way. You're going to have the self-appointed guardians of the status quo coming out of the woodwork for anything they can do. You're going to have the religious identifications of the system become highly problematic. And I think you get the point. Now, I just realized that in my description of this transitional lecture, I was going to talk about different survival mechanisms and other things that I think can help us, if you will, help those that are aware of it, that want to help also each other in sort of temporal means. And what I'm going to do is the next lecture I do, which I don't have it in front of me and it's going to be postponed until further notice, I will begin with that subject as well and anything else that I haven't been able to include in this lecture. But I do need to go, and I really appreciate everybody listening, and I will talk to everybody very soon, and you'll get an email about the next lecture. Hopefully it won't be more than a couple of weeks. Again, I just have to get my head around the film attributes, which are becoming very complex and very time-specific. All right, everybody, thanks a lot. Talk to you soon.